As the crowd roared, Nick raised his arm in the signature Hogan pose, hand cupped to his ear, inviting the noise, and the stadium responded in unison. For a moment, it felt as though Hulk Hogan himself was there, soaking in the energy one last time. Nick smiled, a mix of pride and sorrow in his eyes, and simply said, "Hulkamania lives forever." The truth was, he was right. The man might be gone, but through his son's dedication and the unity it inspired, Hulkamania had found a new life, one that would stretch far beyond the ropes, the arenas, and even the fans who had been there from the start. And as long as Nick Hogan kept walking the path his father had laid out, the red and yellow spirit would never fade. 5 years later, the red and yellow still flew high. Not just in arenas, but in schools, gyms, community centers, and even in the homes of families who had never watched a single wrestling match. The Hulk Hogan Foundation had grown into a global movement, with programs running on nearly every continent. What began as Nick Hogan's way of honoring his father's memory had evolved into a legacy that transcended the squared circle entirely. The wrestling world itself looked different. WWE, AEW, and JPW and countless independent promotions now participated annually in Hulkamania Week, a cross-promotional celebration held every August to honor Hogan's contributions. It wasn't just about nostalgia, it was about action. Each promotion hosted charity matches, fundraising autograph sessions, and youth workshops, all with proceeds going toward the Foundation's programs. The once unthinkable image of wrestlers from rival companies sharing the same ring had become an annual tradition, and it all stemmed from Nick's determination to make his father's message bigger than the business. Young wrestlers who had come through the Foundation's Path to the Ring program were now breaking into the industry, and many wore small red and yellow patches on their gear as a tribute. Some of them spoke openly about how they never would have been able to afford training without the scholarship. One high-flying standout, known on the indie scene as the Hurricane Kid, often told fans, "If Hulkamania taught me anything, it's that you don't quit just because the odds are stacked. You power up, brother, and you keep going." Nick had become a fixture not only at wrestling events, but in sports conferences, motivational summits, and charity galas. He didn't try to play the role of his father in public appearances, no bandana, no feather boas, but there was something in his voice and his presence that unmistakably carried Hogan's spirit. His speeches often ended with a variation of the same line, "You don't need a championship belt to be a champion, you just need to lift someone else up." By the 5th anniversary of the Foundation, Nick had expanded its reach far beyond wrestling. Youth centers in underprivileged areas now bore the Hogan name, complete with training gyms, computer labs, and mentorship programs. Some of these centers had walls lined with framed photos of Hogan, one from his early days in Japan, one from the NWO era, and one candid shot of him laughing in the kitchen with his family. For many kids who walked through those doors, those photos were their first introduction to Hulk Hogan, and the stories they heard were less about body slams and more about resilience, respect, and heart. The wrestling industry, once known for its competitive divisions and grudges, had found a rare common ground in supporting the Foundation's mission. Promoters noticed that the annual Hulkamania Week events didn't just raise money, they boosted morale. Locker rooms were friendlier, fan engagement was stronger, and talent turnover decreased as wrestlers felt a greater sense of belonging. Even bitter rivals would share a handshake when they crossed paths at a Hogan event. As one veteran put it, if Hulk could shake hands with the Iron Sheik after all they'd been through, then what excuse do we have? Nick's proudest moment came during the first ever Hogan Legacy Hall, a separate wing inside the WWE Hall of Fame dedicated to those who had used wrestling's platform to make a positive impact outside the ring. The inaugural inductees included not just wrestlers, but referees, trainers, and even longtime fans whose advocacy and charity work had inspired others. Nick stood on stage to present the awards, a giant banner of his father smiling down from above, and as each recipient came forward, the audience roared as if they were celebrating a world title victory. After the ceremony, Nick took a quiet walk to the back of the hall, where a bronze statue of Hulk Hogan stood in full pose, ripping his shirt, muscles flexed, face lit with the iconic grin. Nick rested his hand on the statue's shoulder, the same way he used to stand beside his father in real life. "We did it, pups," he whispered. "And we're still doing it." By then, the Foundation's work had reached over 500,000 young people worldwide. Former scholarship recipients had become coaches, trainers, and mentors themselves, carrying the message forward. The ripple effect was undeniable. An entire generation was growing up with the principles of Hulkamania, self-belief, hard work, kindness, as part of their everyday vocabulary. On the anniversary of Hogan's passing, the Clearwater beach where that famous photo of father and son had been taken became the site of an annual gathering. Thousands showed up every year, wearing red and yellow, to share stories, play music, and watch a tribute video projected on a giant screen facing the water. The night always ended the same way, with the crowd raising their arms to the sky and chanting in unison, "Hogan, Hogan, Hogan," as fireworks burst over the waves. Nick, standing at the shoreline, always kept a small leather notebook in his pocket, the same one his father had left him. It was worn now, the edges fraying, but it still held the same words that had guided him since that day. "One day, you're gonna have to carry the name. Do it with pride and do it your way." And he had, through unity, through action, through an unshakable commitment to something bigger than himself, Nick Hogan had ensured that Hulk Hogan's legacy wasn't just remembered, it was alive. Not as a static memory, but as a living force that continued to inspire, shape, and unite people across the world. For all the championships, for all the main events, for all the thunderous roars that had once echoed through arenas, perhaps this was the true final chapter of Hulkamania, not a farewell, but a passing of the torch. One that would burn bright for as long as there were people willing to believe in themselves and pass it on to the next person. Because in the end, Hulk Hogan was right. Hulkamania really would live forever. Hey there, wrestling family. Today's story is not about a new champion, a shocking heel turn, or a WrestleMania dream match. This one goes far deeper. This is about the kind of moment that stops the entire wrestling world in its tracks. Just days after the passing of the immortal Hulk Hogan, his son, Nick Hogan, broke his silence. And what he shared wasn't just a statement, it was an open wound. Raw, unfiltered, and heartbreakingly real. If you grew up raising your hand to your ear when his music hit, if you've ever shouted, "Whatcha gonna do, brother?" just for the fun of it, then what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. Because this isn't just the story of a wrestling icon's final goodbye. It's the story of a son saying farewell to his father. The wrestling community was still reeling from the news of Hogan's passing. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a WWE Hall of Famer. He wasn't just a headline act from the 80s and 90s. He was the face of professional wrestling for an entire generation, the man who brought the sport out of dimly lit gyms and into the mainstream spotlight. But amid the flood of tributes from legends like Ric Flair, The Rock, and John Cena, there was one voice that cut through louder than any arena pop. Not because it shouted the loudest, but because it spoke the truth that only a son could know. Nick Hogan's tribute came late at night. Just a single image, the two of them, side by side on a Florida beach. No championship belts, no feather boas, no crowds, just a father and son. The caption was simple, but it hit like a sledgehammer. "You weren't just my dad, you were my hero. I'll keep your voice with me forever. I love you, Pops." Within minutes, that post went global. Tens of thousands of comments poured in, fans telling Nick to stay strong, wrestlers promising to carry on Hulkamania, old friends sharing never-before-heard stories from the road. And then, Nick began to share more. Through interviews, social media posts, and conversations with friends, Nick began pulling back the curtain on the man the world knew as Hulk Hogan. Not the 24-inch pythons or the trash-talking superstar, but the father who made pancakes every Sunday morning when he was home from the road. He told stories of watching movies together until his dad fell asleep halfway through with his hands behind his head. Of learning to drive in a beat-up old truck, Hogan laughing the entire time at Nick's nervous stops and starts, but there were hard truths too. Hogan's career kept him on the road for much of Nick's childhood. There were times, Nick admitted, when I just wanted my dad at home. Not Hulk Hogan, just Dad. But with time, he came to understand. He was building something not just for himself, but for me, for our family, for the fans. And now, looking back, I get it. He gave every ounce of himself to make other people smile. Nick also shared glimpses of his father's final days. Even in the hospital, Hogan was reportedly cracking jokes with the nurses, asking about WWE storylines, and repeating his famous line, "Train hard, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins." Nick recalled holding his father's hand and realizing they didn't need words in that moment. "I knew he loved me. I knew he was proud. That's all I ever needed." The tribute sparked a movement. Hashtags like #ForeverHulk and #HulkamaniaLives flooded social media. Fans dusted off vintage t-shirts, pulled old action figures from storage, and shared the first match they ever saw Hogan wrestle. WWE approached Nick about participating in a televised memorial. At first, he hesitated, still raw from the loss, but ultimately agreed. "If I can help the fans say goodbye," he told producers, "I'm doing it for him." When that episode aired, Nick stood in the center of an empty ring, a single spotlight overhead. To the world, he was Hulk Hogan. To me, he was Dad, he began. He always said Hulkamania would never die, and now it's up to us to keep it alive. The crowd's response was deafening. "Thank you, Hogan," echoed through the arena, not as a chant for a wrestler, but as a farewell to a man who had touched countless lives. In Clearwater, plans began for something unprecedented. A public memorial that would bring together wrestling's biggest names across all promotions. WWE, AEW, legends from WCW and JPW and beyond. Rivals became allies for one night, united in honoring the man who had given so much to the business. The arena was draped in red and yellow. Hogan's boots, championship belts, and ring gear lined the entrance ramp. Video screens played highlights from WrestleMania 3, the NWO era, and his countless main events. Fans spoke. Wrestlers told stories of Hogan's kindness away from the cameras, covering a rookie's travel costs, paying medical bills in secret, staying late to sign every last autograph. Then Nick stepped into the ring. Holding that same beach photo, he told the crowd, "I used to think Hulkamania belonged to the fans and the ring. But I've learned it belongs to all of us, to anyone who believed in themselves because he told them they could." Tonight, we say goodbye to the man, but not to what he gave us. That will never die. When Real American hit one final time, the entire arena rose to its feet. Thousands pointed to the sky, chanting, "Hogan, Hogan," as fireworks lit up the rafters. But Nick's tribute didn't end that night. In the months that followed, he launched the Hulk Hogan Foundation, dedicated to giving young athletes opportunities they might never have otherwise had. Scholarships, training programs, anti-bullying campaigns. WWE, AEW, and even independent promotions threw their support behind it. "It's not about the brand," Nick said. "It's about the people." The foundation's first major initiative, Path to the Ring, gave aspiring wrestlers full access to training schools, gear, and mentorship. Many of those first scholarship recipients would go on to become stars in their own right, always wearing a small red and yellow patch on their gear as a nod to where they started. 5 years later, Hulkamania Week had become a global celebration. Rival promotions set aside differences to raise money for youth sports and community outreach. Young wrestlers spoke openly about how the foundation changed their lives. And every August, thousands gathered on the same Clearwater beach from Nick's tribute photo. At sunset, they raised their arms to the sky, chanting, "Hogan, Hogan, Hogan," as fireworks reflected over the water. Nick always attended, the same leather-bound notebook in his pocket, the one his father had filled with advice years before. On the inside cover, Hogan had written, "One day, you're gonna have to carry the name. Do it with pride and do it your way." Nick had done exactly that. Hulk Hogan may have been the Immortal, but it was his son's love and the movement it inspired that made those words true. Hulkamania didn't just live forever in the ring, it lived forever in the hearts of everyone who believed. What happened in the wrestling world was already historic, but the story didn't stop there. Hulkamania had been born in the ring, but thanks to Nick Hogan, it was now spilling into spaces far beyond the squared circle. Schools began adopting the Foundation's Champions Code program, a series of workshops built around the principles Hulk Hogan preached for decades: self-belief, discipline, respect, and giving back. Teachers reported that students, many of whom had never even heard of Hulk Hogan before, were showing up to class wearing red and yellow wristbands with the words "Believe in yourself" printed in bold. Nick began traveling internationally, bringing the Foundation to countries where wrestling had never been a mainstream phenomenon. In small towns in South America, kids crowded into community gyms to meet him, not because they'd seen his father's matches, but because they'd heard about the opportunities his foundation was creating. In parts of Africa, sports programs supported by the Foundation were giving children a safe place to train, learn, and dream. And in Japan, a special memorial wrestling event drew thousands, blending Japanese puroresu traditions with tributes to Hogan's legacy. It wasn't just about the money raised, it was about the lives changed. And Nick, now 5 years into this mission, had embraced a role he never thought he'd want: public leader. Inside wrestling, something else was happening, something even veteran insiders couldn't ignore. The competitive barriers between promotions, while still present in business dealings, had softened in human relationships. Wrestlers who had once been separated by company lines now collaborated more frequently for charity exhibitions and foundation events. Younger talent grew up seeing legends from rival promotions working together, and it began shaping the culture of the locker room. Roman Reigns, now recognized as one of the modern era's most influential figures, credited Hulkamania Week for reminding the industry of its shared roots. At the end of the day, "We're all in this because someone made us believe we could be," he said in a panel discussion. Hulk did that for millions. Nick's keeping that alive. Every August, the Clearwater Beach gathering became more than just a memorial. It became a pilgrimage. Fans flew in from all over the world, sometimes bringing their children or grandchildren to experience the tribute firsthand. The event grew to include live music, video screens replaying Hogan's most famous moments, and guest appearances from wrestlers who shared personal stories under the setting sun. On the 6th year, something unforgettable happened. As the fireworks began, a massive hologram projection of Hulk Hogan appeared over the water, smiling, posing, and cupping his ear to the crowd. The roar that followed was unlike anything Nick had ever heard since his father's passing. People sobbed. People laughed. And in that moment, it felt as if Hulkamania itself had stepped out of history and into the present. Nick later revealed that the hologram was a project years in the making, compiled from countless hours of footage, audio samples, and motion capture data. "I didn't want it to be gimmicky," he said. "I wanted it to feel like he was really here." Because in a way, he is. Despite the success, Nick never pretended the road was easy. In interviews, he was candid about the weight of carrying the Hogan name, not in the wrestling sense, but in the responsibility to live up to what it stood for. There were moments of exhaustion, days when the demands of running a global foundation clashed with his own personal life. But every time he thought about slowing down, he would return to that notebook, to the line his father had written: "Do it with pride and do it your way." And over time, Nick began to notice something. People weren't just coming to foundation events to honor Hulk Hogan anymore. They were coming because they believed in Nick's vision. His authenticity, his openness about grief and purpose, had given the legacy a new chapter, one that wasn't stuck in the past, but growing toward the future. The 10th anniversary of Hulk Hogan's passing was marked by the largest Hulkamania Week yet. WWE, AEW, and JPW, Impact Wrestling, and dozens of independent promotions held synchronized tribute shows, all feeding into a single global fundraising goal. Cities lit up their landmarks in red and yellow. Social media feeds were flooded with fans striking Hogan's iconic pose. That year's Clearwater Beach gathering drew over 50,000 people. When Nick took the stage, He didn't carry the beach photo or the championship belts. Instead, he carried the original Hulkamania shirt from Hogan's WrestleMania 3 match, the same one Hogan had ripped off his chest before slamming Andre the Giant. "I've kept this safe for decades," Nick told the crowd. "Because it's not just a shirt. It's a reminder of the moment the impossible became possible." That's what Hulkamania means. And that's what I'm asking all of you to keep alive, not just for Dad, but for yourselves. The crowd roared, the chants began, and as Nick looked out over the ocean of fans, he realized something profound. Hulk Hogan may have started Hulkamania, but now it belonged to the world. He spent hours signing autographs, taking pictures, and even slipping into character for one last round of playful trash talk. Nick later revealed that his father had confided in him after that convention, saying, "That might be my last time with the fans in person. If it is, I want them to remember me smiling." It was a moment Nick said he'll never forget because it wasn't about the fame or the spotlight. It was about the bond between performer and audience, a bond his father treasured until the very end. In the days before Hogan's death, the family kept things intensely private. Friends who visited the Hogan home in Clearwater described a peaceful atmosphere, sunlight streaming through open windows, old wrestling photos covering the walls, and the faint sound of ocean waves in the distance. Nick said he spent hours just sitting with his dad, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes watching old matches together. "He'd start telling me behind-the-scenes stories I'd never heard," Nick shared in one interview. Like how nervous he was before body-slamming Andre at WrestleMania 3, or how much it meant to him when fans lined the streets after his match in Japan. Those weren't just career highlights to him, they were proof that what he did mattered. After Hogan's passing, the outpouring of love from fans and wrestlers alike only reinforced Nick's desire to do something monumental. Plans began to take shape for a memorial event that would not only honor his father's wrestling achievements, but also celebrate his role as a cultural icon. Nick reached out personally to some of Hogan's closest friends and fiercest rivals, Ric Flair, Macho Man Randy Savage's family, Sting, Kevin Nash, and even wrestlers from outside WWE who had crossed paths with Hogan in the territories. "If they shared a ring or a locker room with him, I want them there," Nick reportedly told organizers. The idea was to hold the event in Hogan's home state of Florida, in an arena that could accommodate thousands of fans but still feel personal. There would be no matches, no scripted promos, just stories, memories, and music that captured the spirit of Hulkamania. Nick envisioned an entrance ramp lined with memorabilia, the original yellow boots, the tearaway shirts, championship belts, and even the guitar from his infamous WCW Hollywood Hogan days. Large screens would play highlights from across decades, Hogan's WWF Championship victories, his battles against the Iron Sheik, his role in the NWO, and even his cameos in movies and TV. But the heart of the event would be the people. Nick wanted fans to speak, to share their own stories of meeting Hogan or how he inspired them during tough times. Dad always said wrestling wasn't about the moves, it was about making people feel something. "I want to give them a chance to tell him what he made them feel," Nick said. The wrestling industry quickly rallied behind the idea. WWE offered production support, AEW extended an open invitation for their talent to participate, and legends who hadn't stepped into a wrestling ring in years agreed to attend. Even wrestlers who had clashed publicly with Hogan in the past came forward to express their desire to be there, admitting that whatever issues existed in life, the man's impact on the business was undeniable. Meanwhile, in Clearwater, Nick spent long nights going through his father's personal collection of memorabilia. He found handwritten notes for promos, scrapbooks filled with fan letters, and VHS tapes of matches Hogan had saved for decades. One of the most touching discoveries was a small, leather-bound notebook labeled Nick. Inside were pages of personal reflections Hogan had written over the years, advice, encouragement, and memories. Some pages were lighthearted, others deeply emotional. "It was like he'd been writing to me my whole life, just in case he wasn't around someday," Nick said. "Reading it now, it's like he's still talking to me." As news of the memorial spread, Fans began traveling from all over the world to Florida. Hotels near the planned venue reported being fully booked within days. Social media was flooded with posts from people holding up tickets to the event, many of them saying it would be their way of saying goodbye to their childhood hero. Merchandise stands began designing special Forever Immortal shirts, with proceeds going toward a charity supporting youth sports, something Hogan had been passionate about throughout his life. Nick admitted that the preparations were both cathartic and painful. "Every time I hear his entrance music, it hits me all over again," he confessed. "But I know he'd want the music to play. He'd want the fans chanting. He'd want it to feel like a celebration, not a funeral." The day of the memorial finally arrived, and from the moment the doors opened, it was clear this was something special. The arena floor was draped in red and yellow, with spotlights casting a golden glow over the stage. Fans held up signs reading "Thank you, Hogan" and "Hulkamania Forever." Some wore vintage t-shirts from the 1980s. Others had dressed their kids in the same gear, passing down the tradition to a new generation. Nick walked into the building hours before the event began, taking a moment to stand in the middle of the empty ring. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and imagined the roar of the crowd his father had heard countless times. "This is for you, Dad," he whispered. As the tribute began, legends and fans alike shared stories that spanned decades. Ric Flair recalled the night Hogan convinced him to join WWF in the early 90s, saying, "He made me believe there was another mountain to climb." Kevin Nash talked about Hogan's generosity during the NWO era, when he'd quietly cover medical bills for injured wrestlers without ever asking for recognition. A young fan spoke tearfully about meeting Hogan at a charity event and how he had taken the time to sit with her for 20 minutes, listening to her talk about her dream of becoming a wrestler. But the most emotional moment came when Nick stepped into the ring. He stood there, holding that same beach photo he'd posted in his original tribute, and addressed the crowd. "I used to think Hulkamania belonged to the fans and the ring. But I've learned it belongs to all of us, to anyone who believed in themselves because he told them they could. Tonight, we say goodbye to the man, but not to what he gave us. That will never die." The arena erupted, the chants echoing long after Nick left the ring. And as the event closed with Hogan's iconic theme music playing one last time, thousands of fans stood together, pointing to the sky, as if sending one final "Whatcha gonna do, brother?" to the Immortal One himself. When the last note of "Real American" faded and the lights in the arena dimmed, a strange kind of silence settled over the crowd, a silence that wasn't empty, but full. It was the kind of quiet you get after witnessing something monumental, when people are too overwhelmed to speak. Fans hugged strangers in the aisles, wiping their eyes with the same red and yellow bandanas they'd waved in the air moments earlier. Some lingered in their seats, as if leaving would make the goodbye feel more final. Others drifted toward the exit slowly, sharing whispered stories about when they first saw Hogan wrestle, or the autograph he'd signed for them decades ago that they still kept tucked away at home. Backstage, Nick Hogan was still standing near the entrance curtain, catching his breath. The weight of the night pressed against his chest, not just from the speeches, but from the tidal wave of emotion that had poured toward him. Wrestlers who had been his father's allies and rivals alike came to embrace him, some without saying a word, just holding him for a moment before moving on. The bond in those handshakes and hugs didn't need explaining. Everyone in that building knew what they had just been part of was bigger than wrestling. When the arena finally cleared, Nick walked the empty floor one last time, stopping by the ring where so many had spoken. The mat was still warm from the lights, the ropes faintly smelling of the fresh vinyl polish applied earlier that day. He rested his hand on the middle rope, closed his eyes, and could almost hear his father's voice, playful yet commanding, cutting through the air. "All right, brother, one more time for the people." It was as if the ghost of Hulkamania itself still lingered, refusing to leave quietly. The following morning, the Hogan family gathered at their Clearwater home for a private remembrance. It wasn't a media event, no cameras, no press releases, just close friends and relatives sitting around the backyard Hogan loved so much. The Florida sun was bright, the ocean breeze gentle, and a table in the center held framed photos of Hogan from every era of his life. Childhood snapshots, early wrestling days, the peak WWF years, the Hollywood Hogan era, and candid shots of him laughing with his kids. Nick had prepared something for this gathering too, though it was less a speech and more a conversation. He stood beside the table, holding the leather-bound notebook he discovered among his father's things. "I want to share a few pages," he said quietly, his voice steady but soft. He read aloud passages Hogan had written just for him. Words of encouragement, fatherly advice, little jokes, and reminders to stay true to himself. Some lines drew laughter, others drew tears. When Nick read one note where Hogan had written, "One day, you're gonna have to carry the name. Do it with pride and do it your way," the entire gathering fell silent. Those words, written years before this moment, felt almost prophetic. The afternoon rolled into evening, and the family lit candles along the deck, letting them drift out into the water as a symbolic farewell. Each candle carried a whispered message, thanks, love, or just the simple act of remembering. Nick watched them float away, the flickering lights reflecting off the waves like tiny fragments of his father's spirit returning to the world. In the days after the memorial, Nick's life took on a new rhythm. He wasn't just the grieving son anymore. He was now the keeper of the flame. Interview requests flooded in from networks, podcasts, and wrestling outlets. Some he accepted, others he turned down. He was careful not to let his father's story be reduced to sound bites or sensational headlines. "I'm not here to rewrite his history," he told one reporter. "I'm here to protect it." That protection extended beyond just talking about Hogan's career. Nick began quietly organizing the next step in honoring his father's legacy, a permanent Hulk Hogan Foundation dedicated to mentoring and supporting young athletes. The mission, he explained, would be about more than sports. Dad believed in discipline, in confidence, in finding something you love and chasing it with everything you've got. That's what we want to pass on. Plans were already in motion for scholarship programs, youth training camps, and even an annual Hulkamania Day, where kids could participate in activities inspired by Hogan's career and values. The wrestling community, still riding the emotional high of the memorial, quickly offered to help. Legends volunteered their time to appear at foundation events. Promoters pledged portions of ticket sales to the cause. Merchandise manufacturers began designing limited edition collectibles, with proceeds going directly to the foundation. It was becoming clear that Nick's stewardship of his father's name wasn't just about preserving memories, it was about creating something that would outlast both of them. Fans noticed a change in Nick as well. For years, he'd lived somewhat in the shadow of his father's fame, often reluctant to step into the spotlight. But now, in interviews and public appearances, there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, a steadiness that felt familiar to anyone who had ever watched Hulk Hogan stride to the ring. It wasn't that Nick was trying to be his father, it was that he had found his own way to honor him. Even as he took on this new role, the grief was still there. Nick admitted in one heartfelt podcast appearance that some mornings were harder than others. "I'll hear a song on the radio, or I'll see a clip of Dad in the ring, and it just hits me all over again," he said. "But then I remember what he told me, that the show must go on, brother." And for him, it always will. One of the most touching developments came when fans began sending Nick letters, not emails, but handwritten notes, sharing how Hulk Hogan had inspired them through illness, loss, or personal struggles. Nick kept every single one, storing them in the same leather-bound notebook his father had once used. "Someday," he said, "I'll read these to my kids, so they understand what their grandfather meant to people." Months after the memorial, the Hogan family returned to that Florida beach from the famous photo Nick had posted in his tribute. It was a quiet afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip toward the horizon. Nick stood in the same spot, this time without his father's arm around his shoulder, but with the same ocean stretching out before him. He pulled a small handful of sand into his palm, let it sift slowly through his fingers, and whispered, "Still with me, Pops." The wind seemed to catch his words and carry them out over the water, and for a moment, Nick swore he could hear the faint echo of his father's laugh, the one that used to fill locker rooms, arenas, and their family home. Whether it was real or just memory didn't matter. What mattered was that Hulkamania, in all its larger-than-life glory, still lived on in the ring, in the fans, and most of all, in the heart of the son who loved him, and for Nick Hogan, that was enough to keep going. In the months that followed, the Hulk Hogan Foundation began to grow from an idea born out of grief into a force with real momentum, one that was starting to ripple across the wrestling industry in ways nobody had anticipated. What began as a tribute project to honor Hogan's legacy soon became a unifying symbol, bridging the gaps between companies, generations, and fan bases that had long been divided. Nick Hogan, once hesitant to step into the limelight, found himself at the forefront of an unexpected movement. His initial plan had been modest: create a platform to help young athletes gain access to training and mentorship. But the moment he announced the foundation publicly, the wrestling world responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. WWE immediately offered to host fundraising events, AEW reached out to collaborate on special appearances, and even independent promotions, some run out of high school gyms, wanted in. It's not about the brand, Nick told a crowd at one of the early press events. It's about keeping the spirit alive. Dad gave everything to the fans. This is how we give back. The first major initiative of the foundation was something Nick called the Path to the Ring program, a scholarship fund for aspiring wrestlers who couldn't afford training school tuition or travel to tryouts. Within weeks, donations poured in from fans, wrestlers, and even celebrities outside the industry who had been inspired by Hogan at some point in their lives. Triple H personally pledged a significant contribution, noting that Hulk paved the way for all of us. This is the least we can do. Chris Jericho, representing AEW, echoed the sentiment, saying, "We talk about breaking down walls in wrestling. This is one wall worth tearing down together." Perhaps the most symbolic moment of the foundation's early days came at a cross-promotional event held in Tampa. WWE and AEW talent shared the same stage, shaking hands and telling stories about their encounters with Hogan. Legends like Ric Flair, Sting, and Kevin Nash sat alongside modern stars like Seth Rollins, Cody Rhodes, and Roman Reigns. There were no scripted rivalries that night, only shared memories, laughter, and genuine respect. Nick, standing at the center of it all, admitted he was seeing something Dad always wished for: wrestling coming together for something bigger than the business. The foundation didn't limit itself to wrestling-related causes. Nick expanded its mission to include youth sports programs, anti-bullying campaigns, and community outreach initiatives in low-income neighborhoods. "Dad always told me to use whatever platform I had to lift people up," Nick explained. Hulkamania wasn't just about wrestling, it was about making people feel strong. Partnerships were formed with gyms, schools, and community centers across the country, each carrying the red and yellow branding and the familiar message: train hard, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins. Media outlets began covering the story not as a wrestling headline, but as a broader cultural shift. The image of Nick Hogan had transformed from celebrity son to legacy builder. Fans started seeing him at charity events, hosting seminars for young athletes, and even getting in the ring occasionally, not to wrestle competitively, but to demonstrate techniques and tell stories from his father's career. "I'm not trying to be Hulk Hogan," he told one group of trainees, "but I am trying to pass along what he taught me, because that's worth more than any title belt." One of the most touching moments came at a foundation-hosted youth wrestling showcase in Orlando. A group of kids, many of whom had never even been to a live wrestling event, got to train for a day with some of the biggest names in the business. At the end of the day, they gathered in the ring as Nick stood in the center, holding a replica of his father's classic WWF Championship belt. "This is just a symbol," he told them. "The real championship is believing in yourself, no matter what." He handed the belt to a 12-year-old participant who had overcome serious health challenges to be there, and the crowd erupted into chants of "Hogan, Hogan." The foundation's success began to inspire other wrestling families to start their own legacy projects. Bret Hart's family launched an initiative to promote heart health awareness. The late Macho Man Randy Savage's relatives partnered with the Hogan Foundation on a youth mentorship program. Slowly, the industry's landscape began to shift, not just because of the programs themselves, but because of the spirit behind them. Competition would always be part of wrestling, but these collaborations reminded everyone that there were times when unity mattered more. Nick's commitment to his father's values also started changing how he was perceived by fans who had once viewed him only through the lens of tabloid headlines. In meet and greets, people would approach him not just to talk about Hogan, but to thank him personally for keeping Hulkamania alive in such a meaningful way. "It's like he's channeling his dad," one fan said at a convention. "Not by imitating him, but by living the way Hogan always told us to live, full of energy, full of heart, and always for the fans." The culmination of the Foundation's first year came at WrestleMania, where WWE and AEW agreed to jointly sponsor a special Hulk Hogan Legacy Award. Presented in the middle of the grandest stage of them all, the award honored individuals, wrestlers and non-wrestlers alike, who embodied Hogan's ideals of perseverance, generosity, and fan connection. Nick stood at the podium in front of tens of thousands in the stadium and millions watching around the world. He spoke about his father's larger-than-life persona, but more importantly, about the small, unseen acts of kindness that defined him just as much as his in-ring triumphs. Hulk Hogan's son Nick painfully pays tribute to him days after his death. The wrestling world is in shock. Days after the passing of WWE legend Hulk Hogan, his son Nick Hogan delivers an emotional and heartbreaking tribute that fans will never forget. In this video, we revisit the legacy of the Immortal, Hulk Hogan, and share the deeply personal words from his son that left millions in tears. From touching family memories to rare stories fans have never heard, this is a moment that reminds us of Hogan's impact far beyond the wrestling ring. If you're a lifelong WWE fan or someone who grew up saying, "Whatcha gonna do, brother?" this tribute will hit you right in the heart. Hey there, wrestling family. Welcome back to the channel. Today's story isn't about championship belts, heel turns, or shocking betrayals in the ring. No, this is something much deeper, much more personal, and it's hitting the WWE universe harder than any steel chair ever could. Just days after the passing of the legendary, immortal Hulk Hogan, his son, Nick Hogan, has broken his silence. And what he shared isn't just a statement, it's an open wound, a raw and unfiltered tribute that has left millions of fans across the globe fighting back tears. If you've ever chanted Hogan, Hogan, in a crowded arena, if you've ever raised your hand to your ear when his music hit, or if you've ever shouted, "Whatcha gonna do, brother?" just for the fun of it, then what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. The wrestling world has been spinning since the news broke. Hogan wasn't just another superstar. He wasn't just a Hall of Famer. He was the face that defined an era, the man who took professional wrestling from smoky halls and regional circuits to the bright lights of mainstream entertainment. His charisma was unmatched, his presence larger than life. Yet now, for the first time in nearly 5 decades, the WWE world is moving forward without him. But even as fans and fellow wrestlers struggle to process the loss, it's the family he left behind, especially his son Nick, who are feeling the weight of the void the hardest. In the days since Hulk Hogan's passing, social media has been flooded with tributes. Legends like Ric Flair, The Rock, and Stone Cold Steve Austin have all shared their stories. Fans from Tokyo to Toronto have posted photos from the days they met him, hugged him, or even just got a smile from him at an autograph signing. But amidst all of that noise, Nick Hogan's voice cut through like a bell. Not because it was louder, but because it was so painfully real. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't polished. It wasn't the kind of statement you give to please the media. This was a son speaking about his father, about the man behind the handlebar mustache, and the red and yellow gear. Nick's tribute came in the form of a late-night post, a single image of the two of them, side by side on a Florida beach. Hogan wasn't in his trademark bandana or his signature shades. He was in a worn-out tank top, sunburned, barefoot, with his arm draped over his son's shoulder. The caption wasn't long, but it said everything. "You weren't just my dad, you were my hero." I'll keep your voice with me forever. I love you, Pops." Within minutes, the post exploded. Tens of thousands of comments poured in, fans telling Nick to stay strong, wrestlers promising to carry on Hogan's legacy, and old friends sharing stories from decades past. What made this tribute so powerful wasn't just the words. It was the flood of memories that Nick began sharing in the hours that followed. In a series of posts and interviews, he opened a door that most fans never got to see. He talked about Hogan not as the Immortal, but as the man who made pancakes every Sunday morning when he wasn't on the road. He described nights on the couch watching movies together, Hogan falling asleep halfway through with his hands behind his head. He told the story of his dad teaching him how to drive, not in some fancy car, but in a beat-up old truck that Hogan swore was good enough to learn the ropes. These weren't stories of arenas and titles, they were stories of a father and a son, and they hit the wrestling world like a tidal wave. Nick also addressed something that many had wondered, what it was like to share his father with the world. Hogan was on the road constantly during Nick's childhood, headlining WrestleMania, making TV appearances, doing media tours. Nick admitted it wasn't easy. "There were times," he said, "when I just wanted my dad at home. Not Hulk Hogan, just Dad." He spoke about missing birthdays, school plays, and the quiet moments that get lost when you're living under the lights. But he didn't share this with resentment. He shared it with understanding. He was building something, Nick said. Not just for himself, but for me, for our family, for the fans. And now, looking back, I get it. He gave everything he had, every ounce of himself, to make other people smile. Perhaps the most gut-wrenching part of Nick's tribute was when he described his father's final days. While Nick didn't go into medical details, he painted a picture of a man who, even at the very end, wanted to make people feel good. Hogan was reportedly still cracking jokes with the nurses, still asking about WWE storylines, still telling Nick to train hard, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins, the same line he'd said to millions of Hulkamaniacs over the years. Nick recalled sitting by his father's bedside, holding his hand, feeling the weight of a lifetime of moments between them. "We didn't need to say much," he shared. "We just looked at each other, and I knew he loved me. I knew he was proud of me. That's all I ever needed." The tribute also sparked a wave of rare, behind-the-scenes stories from Hogan's inner circle. Stories that Nick had either never told before or never thought anyone would care about. He revealed how Hogan used to send him ridiculous motivational voicemails before big events, like when Nick had his first race in motorsports. Hogan's message? "Go out there and smash it, brother. But don't actually smash anything or your mom's gonna kill me." He shared the way Hogan would randomly show up to his events in full Hulk gear, just to embarrass him in front of his friends, only for everyone to end up asking for autographs anyway. But as heartwarming as these memories were, there was a deep sadness underneath them. Every laugh in Nick's stories seemed to have a shadow. Every fond memory was bittersweet, because it came with the realization that there would be no more of them. No more father-son beach days. No more random phone calls in the middle of the night just to talk about old matches. No more of that booming laugh echoing through the house. "It's like the whole world got quieter," Nick said in one interview. "Not just my world. Everyone's." Wrestlers from every generation chimed in to support Nick in his grief. John Cena, who grew up idolizing Hogan, called Nick's tribute the most honest thing I've seen in years. Ric Flair, who had his share of battles with Hogan in and out of the ring, told reporters that Hulk would be smiling seeing Nick speak from the heart like that. Even The Rock posted a heartfelt message to Nick, telling him, "Your dad was one of my heroes too. And you just honored him in the most beautiful way." The wrestling community, often divided over eras and styles, seemed united in this one moment of collective mourning. Yet, the public side of this tribute only scratches the surface of what Nick has been dealing with behind closed doors. Losing a parent is never easy, but losing a parent who is also a public icon brings a different kind of grief. Nick has had to navigate not just his own emotions, but the tidal wave of attention from millions of strangers who feel like they lost someone too. Friends close to him have said he's been balancing two worlds, the private world of a grieving son and the public world of a man expected to represent his father's legacy. It's a tightrope walk no one can truly prepare for. Still, through the tears and the pain, Nick's words have done something extraordinary. They've reminded the world that Hulk Hogan's greatest legacy wasn't just in the ring. It wasn't the body slams, the promos, or even the unforgettable matches. It was the man he was when the cameras weren't rolling. It was the father who showed up for his kids in his own unique way. It was the friend who would take your call at 3 a.m. It was the human being who, for all his fame and all his flaws, never stopped trying to connect with the people he loved, and maybe that's why Nick's tribute has resonated so deeply. Because at its core, it's not just about saying goodbye to a wrestling legend. It's about saying goodbye to a dad. A dad who just happened to be one of the most recognizable figures in the world. A dad who made the world cheer, but more importantly, made his son proud. And in the end, maybe that's the championship belt that matters most. Nick's tribute has become more than a post. It's become a moment, one that will be replayed in the hearts of fans for years to come. It's the kind of moment that, much like Hogan himself, is larger than life, yet deeply human. And while the loss still feels fresh, the words of a grieving son have given the wrestling world something to hold on to, a reminder that the bonds we form off-camera are the ones that truly last. Nick ended his most recent message with a line that feels like it belongs in the closing chapter of Hulk Hogan's story. "You taught me to be strong, but right now I just miss you. I'll see you again someday, Pops. Until then, I'll keep the Hulkamania alive." The world may have lost the immortal Hulk Hogan, but through his son's love and his fans' memories, his spirit isn't going anywhere. And as long as there's a crowd somewhere chanting his name, Hulkamania will never die. In the days that followed Nick Hogan's emotional tribute, something extraordinary began to unfold, not just in the wrestling community, but across the broader world of sports and entertainment. What started as a heartfelt message from a grieving son began to evolve into a living memorial, fueled by fans, fellow wrestlers, and people who had never even stepped foot inside a wrestling arena. Hashtags like #ForeverHulk and #Hulkamania began trending worldwide. Fans were posting photos of their Hulk Hogan action figures, dusting off vintage red and yellow t-shirts, and sharing stories of how Hogan's larger-than-life persona shaped their childhoods. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a wave of collective gratitude, sparked by the vulnerability in Nick's words. People weren't only mourning the wrestler who body-slammed Andre the Giant or headlined WrestleMania, they were remembering the moments when Hogan's message of strength, determination, and belief in oneself resonated with them during their own battles. The tribute had peeled back the spandex and pyro, revealing the man behind the legend, and in doing so, reminded fans why they loved him in the first place. Nick, in the midst of his own grief, seemed almost overwhelmed by the response. Close friends revealed that his phone didn't stop buzzing for days. Messages from wrestlers past and present, from old family friends, and from fans who simply wanted to say, "Thank you." Many of them weren't just thanking him for sharing his memories, they were thanking him for giving them permission to grieve. Professional wrestling often thrives on larger-than-life personas, but death has a way of stripping all of that away, leaving behind something much simpler and far more universal: the human need to say goodbye. Behind the scenes, WWE began quietly discussing how to properly honor Hulk Hogan's legacy. Sources from within the company hinted at plans for a tribute episode, complete with a 10-bell salute, video packages spanning his decades in the business, and testimonials from the stars who knew him best. It was a rare moment of unity. Wrestlers who had once been fierce rivals were now speaking with one voice. Ric Flair, who'd been there for some of Hogan's most iconic matches, told one backstage interviewer, "There will never be another Hulk Hogan. You can debate eras, styles, and draws all you want, but there's only one Immortal." Nick was approached about participating in WWE's tribute plans, and while he initially hesitated, still raw from the personal loss, he ultimately agreed. Not because he wanted the spotlight, but because he knew his father would have wanted the fans to have closure. Dad always said the fans were the reason he kept going, Nick shared in a quiet conversation captured by a behind-the-scenes camera crew. "If I can help them say goodbye, I'm doing it for him. When the tribute episode aired, Nick's segment was the emotional centerpiece. Standing in the middle of an empty wrestling ring, the lights dimmed except for a single spotlight, he spoke softly, but with conviction. To the world, he was Hulk Hogan. To me, he was Dad. And while you all knew him for the matches, the promos, and the energy he brought every night, I knew him for the way he never stopped believing in me, in himself, in all of you. He always said Hulkamania would never die, and now it's up to us to keep it alive. The crowd that filled the arena that night erupted into chants of "Thank you, Hogan," and "Hulkamania." As Nick stepped back, visibly moved by the outpouring of love, the tribute episode became one of the most watched segments in WWE's recent history, with millions tuning in across multiple platforms. But what made it powerful wasn't just the numbers, it was the sincerity. There was no overproduction, no attempt to turn the moment into a storyline. It was pure, unfiltered respect for a man whose contributions to wrestling were immeasurable. Nick's public appearances in the weeks after his father's death revealed a man determined to protect and nurture his father's legacy. He began sharing more personal stories in interviews, like the time Hogan took him to a small independent wrestling show in a high school gym just so he could see the business at its most grassroots level. "Dad wanted me to understand that it's not about the size of the crowd," Nick explained. "It's about giving your best every single time you step out there. Whether it's 20 people or 20,000, you make them believe." He also recalled moments that showed Hogan's softer side, the times when his father would take the long way home from events just so they could have more time together in the car, talking about everything from life goals to favorite songs. "He could be the loudest guy in the room, but with me, he knew when to just listen," Nick said. "That's something I'll carry with me forever." Fans responded to these glimpses into Hogan's private life with overwhelming appreciation. In an era where celebrity tributes often feel rehearsed or calculated, Nick's openness felt refreshingly genuine. It was clear he wasn't trying to polish his father's image. He was simply speaking the truth as he knew it. And that truth resonated far beyond the wrestling world. Sports journalists, entertainment writers, and even figures from outside of wrestling, actors, musicians, athletes, began sharing their own brief encounters with Hogan and the kindness he showed them. The ripple effect of Nick's tribute was undeniable. Merchandise sales for Hogan's classic shirts and memorabilia spiked, not just as collectibles, but as keepsakes for fans wanting to hold onto a piece of their childhood. Old matches featuring Hogan began trending on the WWE Network and Peacock, as people revisited the moments that made them fall in love with wrestling in the first place. And through it all, Nick remained at the center, not as a marketing tool, but as a living reminder of the man behind the legend. Yet, even as he honored his father publicly, those close to Nick knew the grief was still very real behind the scenes. One family friend noted that the hardest moments weren't the public ones, they were the quiet mornings when Nick would reach for his phone, half expecting to see a text from his dad, only to remember that those messages would never come again. "That's the thing about losing a parent," the friend said. "The world moves on, but you're still stuck in those small moments, wishing you could have just one more." Nick has made it clear that he doesn't want his father's legacy to be frozen in time. He's talked about the possibility of creating a foundation in Hogan's name, dedicated to helping young athletes find their path, just as Hogan once helped so many in the wrestling business. "Dad believed in giving people a shot," Nick said. Whether it was a rookie in the locker room or a kid chasing a dream, he believed in lifting people up. And maybe that's the most fitting way to carry on the Immortal One's memory, not by simply replaying the old matches or quoting the promos, but by living the values he tried to pass on. For Nick, that means keeping Hulkamania alive not just as a brand, but as a mindset, a belief in hard work, resilience, and connecting with people on a personal level. The death of Hulk Hogan may have closed a chapter in wrestling history, but through his son's words and actions, the story isn't over. If anything, it's entering a new phase, one where the legend is remembered not just for the spectacle, but for the humanity behind it. And as long as Nick Hogan keeps sharing his father's spirit with the world, that story will continue to inspire for generations to come. Nick's tribute didn't just honor his father, it reignited the fire in countless fans' hearts. It reminded them why they fell in love with wrestling in the first place and why certain figures transcend the business entirely. Hulk Hogan was one of those figures. And now, through his son's eyes, we've all been given the chance to see the man behind the legend and love him even more for it. In the weeks that followed Hulk Hogan's passing, the wrestling world found itself in a rare moment of unity, one where rivalries, eras, and corporate politics seemed to fade into the background. All eyes turned toward one question: how would the Immortal be given the send-off he deserved? And at the center of it all stood Nick Hogan, still processing the loss of his father, but now thrust into the role of carrying forward a legacy that belonged not just to his family, but to millions around the world. Nick had kept a relatively low profile after his emotional tribute went viral, choosing to avoid the constant media requests and instead focusing on private time with family. But behind closed doors, conversations were happening, conversations about a memorial unlike anything wrestling had seen before. According to sources close to the Hogan family, Nick was adamant that this wouldn't be a scripted WWE segment or a simple Hall of Fame montage. It would be a celebration of life, legacy, and the man behind the legend. Hogan's final public appearances had already become a part of the collective memory. Just months before his passing, he had surprised fans at a small wrestling convention in Tampa, walking out to a stunned crowd that immediately broke into a thunderous chant of "Hogan! Hogan!" Those who were there remember how frail he looked compared to his prime, but how his smile still had the same fire. He knew his body wasn't what it used to be, one fan recalled, but you could see in his eyes, he still lived for that connection.